What if Faith Lehane is the daughter of Samantha Carter? Welcome back to Born into Darkness, Season 2, Episode 4. Observation Room 1. Faith's head was spinning as she looked at Major Carter, then at Daniel, then at Teal'c, before looking back at the Major again. They had told her about traveling to other planets, meeting alien races, and encountering dangerous new technologies. Traveling to other worlds, Faith thought as she searched Carter's face for any sign of deception. Carter was now explaining the Goa'uld, how they had enslaved ancient humans before kidnapping them from Earth and scattering them across the galaxy. Then Teal'c spoke about his years as Apophis' first prime and the terrible things he had been forced to do. Now Faith sat on the bed with her mouth slightly open, struggling to think of something to say. Then her mother told her there was something she needed to know about her grandfather. Daniel began by explaining that there was another branch of the Goa'uld known as the Tok'ra. While they were the same species, their philosophies differed dramatically. The Goa'uld desired to dominate the host. Teal'c explained as Faith looked up at him. They suppress the host's consciousness until it can no longer resist. I have witnessed many Goa'uld take hosts, and I have captured potential hosts myself during my service to the false god. Once the parasite takes control of the body, there is only the desire to conquer and enslave. Nothing else matters. You helped pick out the hosts, Faith asked quietly as she stared at him, unsure what else to say. I did, Teal'c replied with a solemn nod. As I have said, Ellie Carter, I committed many acts that I am not proud of during my service to Apophis. Had I refused, Apophis would have chosen someone far crueler to command his armies. I saved those whom I was able to, however few they numbered. He paid the price for it too, Daniel added as Faith shifted her gaze to him before looking back at Teal'c once more. He explained how Teal'c's wife and son had been shunned by the Jaffa loyal to Apophis, driven from the comfort of their home and forced to live in the slums simply because he had dared to betray his god. Sorry, Faith whispered. Carter smiled softly before telling her that Teal'c's wife and son had eventually been rescued and taken to another world allied with the SGC. She then returned to explaining the Tok'ra, describing how their philosophy centered on a true symbiotic relationship with the host. The host and symbiote shared each other's memories. She also explained that the Tok'ra usually sought willing hosts. However, in desperate situations, a symbiote might enter an unwilling host until a volunteer could be found. I was once the host to a Tok'ra, Carter admitted. Faith stared at her mother, her eyes widening in disbelief. Her name was Jolinar. We were on a planet when it came under attack by the Goa'uld. The others were helping the villagers escape through the Stargate while I went to assist someone who had been injured. I leaned down to give him mouth to mouth when Jolinar entered me. After that, it was like being trapped. I could see everything that was happening, but I couldn't do anything. She spoke to me inside my head, telling me she meant no harm, that she was Tok'ra, and that once she reached her people, they would remove her from my body and transfer her into a willing host. But I refused to believe her. But what we learned later was that Jolinar was being hunted by the Goa'uld, Daniel continued. Faith continued staring at Carter, struggling to process what she had just heard. Her mother had once been possessed by something called a Tok'ra. She became aware that Carter was still holding her hand. Her grip wasn't tight enough to hurt, only firm enough that Faith could have pulled away if she wanted to. She didn't. Her hand remained wrapped in Carter's. Daniel continued explaining that an assassin sent by one of the system lords, a group of immensely powerful Goa'uld, had been hunting Jolinar on that planet. Both the assassin and his host had arrived on Earth with the first wave of refugees. He broke into the base, Carter continued. Then he made his way to where I was. At the time, well, as far as anyone knew, Jolinar was just another Goa'uld. So I was locked in a holding room. The assassin found me there and nearly killed both of us. Teal'c killed him, but not before he injured both Jolinar and me. Major Carter was on the verge of death, Teal'c said gravely. Faith looked at him before turning back to Carter. A sharp ache spread through her chest as she imagined her real mother dying. Her vitals improved after a few hours, Fraser explained. Jolinar gave her life to save mine, Carter said quietly. I still have her memories buried in my shop. I still have her memories buried in my subconscious, and sometimes they rise to the surface as dreams or visions. Her death also had another side effect. My blood chemistry changed. There is a heavy metal called Naquadah in my blood. It allows me to operate certain Goa'uld technologies, but it also means Dr. Fraser has to use specialized medications whenever I'm injured. And, according to the current theory, I can't have another child. Oh, Faith murmured softly. Your grandfather, Carter continued after a brief pause. He had cancer. What? Faith asked, her voice barely above a whisper. In exchange for curing him of the cancer, he became the host to a Tok'ra symbiote named Selmac. They've been together, literally, for about a year now. I think he's currently away on a mission for the Tok'ra High Council, and if you want to meet him, yes, Faith answered immediately, her voice filled with certainty. Yes. A broad smile spread across Carter's face. I'll contact the High Council, she promised. I'll have them send Dad over. Faith nodded while still holding Carter's hand. Daniel and Teal'c exchanged a glance before quietly deciding it would be best to leave the two of them alone. Daniel mentioned that he needed to finish some research, while Teal'c said he had training to attend to. After offering the two women gentle smiles, they turned and left. Fraser told Faith that she would have lunch sent to the room for both of them before following Teal'c and Daniel out, leaving Faith alone with her mother. When Jolinar gave her life, Carter said softly as she looked down at Faith's hands, gently stroking the back of one with her thumbs. The loss was overwhelming. It felt like losing you. I cried the entire night, and while I was recovering, all I could picture was you sitting beside me. Faith lowered her eyes to the gentle movement of Carter's thumbs across the back of her hand. After several quiet moments, she looked back up at the blonde officer, took a slow, steady breath, and prepared to speak. The doc, she said that it would be better, that it's important for you to know what happened to me, Faith whispered, her hands starting to tremble. This was something she had never told anyone, not even Diana Dormer, her first watcher. I think you know the basics from my background check, but there are some things missing. You can take your time, Carter replied gently as Faith looked up at her. Tell me when you feel comfortable. The general talked to me before I came down here. He said that the president would like for you to brief him on your experiences with the council. The president. Yes. Of? The United States. What? Faith exclaimed in disbelief. I'll be there with you, Carter assured her as she leaned forward, while Faith stared at her with wide eyes. I'll be right there by your side, and the general would like you to talk to a counselor about what happened to you in Boston, and another counselor for the both of us. We we don't know each other yet, and he thought that it would be a good idea to get some help. And and I want to know if you're okay with this, or you'd rather we just hang out, or I should warn you that I haven't really hung out with anyone since I joined the Pentagon. Maybe once with the counselor? Faith asked as she gently slipped her hands from the major's before cupping the woman's cheeks. The instant she touched her, Faith felt a jolt race through her body, followed by a comforting warmth. My mother. I'm actually touching my mother, and she's not hitting me or calling me names or threatening me. It's my mother. All right, Carter replied with a soft smile. I'll ask Dr. Fraser for a recommendation. Carter knew she had work to do before the next mission, but all she could focus on was Faith. They remained seated on the bed with their legs hanging over the edge, the blonde officer's arm wrapped around the Slayer's shoulder. After a few moments, Faith rested her head against Carter's shoulder, and they simply sat together in silence, quietly enjoying each other's company. About 2 hours later, Cassie stepped through the infirmary doors and found Faith and Major Carter talking. She had already spoken with Fraser, who was in the main infirmary treating Siler for an electrical burn. The older redhead had told her daughter that Faith knew about the Stargate and what they really did at the SGC. She also told Cassie that it was up to her whether she wanted to tell Faith the truth about where she was from. Excited that she could make a new friend, Without having to lie about who she really was, Cassie walked over carrying a bag in her left hand. Ellie, Sam, Cassie greeted as she stopped beside the bed. Reaching into the bag, she pulled out a pink box. Opening it, she handed a brownie to both Carter and Faith. I already gave Mom one. She told me that Ellie knows about the SGC. Yep, Carter answered as she glanced at Faith, who was holding the brownie in both hands. You know about this place too? Faith asked, turning to Cassie. Uh-huh, Cassie replied with a grin. So, what do you think about aliens, other planets, and all that? It's nice, Faith answered as she looked at her mother before turning back to Cassie. It's exciting. I mean, I met Teal'c, and he's the first alien, or human. I mean, yeah. Well, Cassie said, glancing at the Major before looking back at Faith with an excited smile. You just met another one. Get out, Faith blurted as she leaned forward, her eyes widening even further. She looked at Cassie, then at Carter, who nodded, before staring back at Cassie again. Cassie is the last survivor of a planet called Hanka, Carter explained before she and Cassie told Faith how the Goa'uld Nirti had released a virus that wiped out an entire planet of humans, including an SGC team. Did you find this Nirti? Faith asked. Is she still around? Cassie told Faith that Nirti wasn't going to bother her or Sam or the SGC again. Carter told Faith that Nirti pissed off some of the other Goa'uld system lords and they would punish her. Carter was honest in revealing they were not sure what really happened to her, but Nirti hasn't bothered them again. Good, Faith said before biting into the brownie. Unknown to Carter, Daniel, or Teal'c, Colonel O'Neill interrupted the general in his office while the latter was briefing Colonel Makepeace, the new SG-1 leader, on how his team was gelling. Makepeace admitted that Daniel and Teal'c would probably have problems with his command and that he had not seen much of Major Carter. But I'm sure she'll understand the need for this change, sir, Makepeace said just as O'Neill knocked on the door and stepped inside. Hammond had planned his meeting in his office for that exact time. He had been in contact with O'Neill after the former SG-1 leader called him from a crowded bar and explained that Mayborn had initially been suspicious about being called back so quickly with an answer. However, O'Neill had kept his cool and convinced Mayborn that he was bored out of his skull, that he desperately needed something to do, and that Mayborn's offer was the best fit. In front of Makepeace, O'Neill told the general that he wanted to retire off-world on Idora. He added that he wanted everything arranged as soon as possible because simply being close to the SGC and the Stargate without being able to go on missions was driving him insane. The general then reminded O'Neill that he would not be able to give the latter a GDO, and that once he left, he would be leaving for good. I understand, sir, O'Neill replied with a nod. The two men made arrangements for O'Neill to leave the following day. Afterward, O'Neill gave Makepeace a reassuring pat on the back before heading for the door, deliberately avoiding all of his friends. O'Neill hated not being able to see them, not being able to tell them the truth about what was happening. But he kept reminding himself that the Asgard wanted it this way. He was also worried about Carter and Faith. The general had told him about the meeting with Travers, and O'Neill had made no effort to hide his opinion of the head of the Watchers' Council. Be safe, Carter, O'Neill thought to himself as the elevator doors slid shut. It was about 7:30 in the evening when Carter, having received permission earlier that day from Hammond, walked out through the main lobby with Faith, Daniel, and a woolen cap wearing Teal'c. They headed toward her car, with Daniel and Teal'c accompanying them as a condition for the Major to leave with Faith, especially since they were not sure whether Travers' people still intended to make a move against the Slayer. Earlier that day, Carter had already left a message with the Tok'ra requesting that General Carter return to Earth as soon as possible because it was extremely urgent. However, according to Martouf, who had taken the message, General Carter was away on a mission and would not return until the following day. Carter sighed and asked the Tok'ra to pass along the message, explaining that it was personal in nature. Once the message had been sent, Carter returned to Faith with a fresh set of clothes. She told Faith that they were going to pay a surprise visit to her aunt if Faith felt up to it. Yeah, Faith answered without hesitation as she accepted the clothes from her mother. It was just a pair of sweatpants, a t shirt with the Air Force logo embossed on it, and a brown jacket. Sorry about the clothes, Carter said apologetically. I guess we've got some shopping to do once you're, you know, officially resurrected. And I guess I need to do some grocery shopping too. I mean, I don't spend a lot of time at home because I don't really have a reason to. And, well, I spend most of my days in the SGC just tinkering with the technologies we get through the gate and breathe, Faith interrupted gently. Carter gave the Slayer a small, sheepish smile. She then excused herself and walked into the restroom attached to her room. She smiled faintly at her reflection as she changed into the fresh clothes before stepping back outside. I would like it if we could go, and I mean, I'd like Cassie to go too. I mean, I haven't really done this before. Shopping? Carter asked with an amused smile. No, Faith replied, sitting down on the bed. I mean, going out with my mom, or going out with friends, or, I mean, I did go out before, but that was for some other business that I'm not ready to talk about yet. Or for slaying. And do I still slay? How about we talk about all that once we get back? Carter suggested as she sat beside Faith. Faith simply nodded. Can you tell me about your aunt? Faith asked as they stepped out of her room. 3 compartments. It was around 8 that night when the Major's car pulled into the parking lot of her Aunt Betty's apartment complex. She told the group all about her aunt, including the stroke she had suffered shortly before Carter had been due to report to the Pentagon. She explained that the woman had lost movement along the entire right side of her body, but had regained the use of most of it over the course of 3 years. She's one stubborn woman, Carter said with a fond smile. As they climbed out of the car, she continued telling the others that her aunt now walked with a cane, that her right hand sometimes trembled, and that she was taking medication for it. She still goes to physical therapy, Carter added as they walked toward the front entrance of the apartment building. Carter pressed a button on the intercom panel. A moment later, the speakers buzzed before a familiar voice answered. Yes? Hi, Aunt Betty, Carter called warmly, leaning toward the speaker. Sammy? Yep, Carter replied with a grin as the front door clicked open. She pulled it open for the others. Come in, my dear girl, Betty said, her voice filled with excitement. Carter held the door while Daniel and Teal'c stepped into the hallway, followed by Faith, who glanced at Carter with a small smile before entering as well. Carter then led the small group down the first floor hallway toward a door at the far corner of the building. When they reached it, she raised her hand and knocked softly, while Daniel, Teal'c, and Faith waited quietly behind her. The door soon opened to reveal a grinning woman leaning on a cane as she looked at Carter. Sammy, said Betty warmly as the Major stepped into the apartment and hugged her tightly. It's been so long. Sorry, Carter replied, holding on to Betty with a sense of regret. She then turned around and introduced Daniel, as well as Teal'c, whom she presented as Murray. Strapping fellows, Betty remarked with a playful wink at Carter after the men walked past her and into the house. They're my co-workers, Carter said, rolling her eyes affectionately at Betty. She then turned to face Faith, who stepped into the apartment after Daniel and Teal'c. Carter walked behind Faith to close the door behind her. Once the door was closed, Daniel and Teal'c stood quietly in one corner of the apartment, while the Major and Faith walked over to where Betty was standing and leaning on her cane. Betty looked at Faith with a welcoming smile. And who is this young lady? She works with you at... what was it now? Deep Space Radar Telemetry, Carter smiled, taking a few more steps forward alongside Faith. There's a reason I came by tonight, Aunt Betty. And I'm guessing it's not for the cookies in the oven, the older woman asked knowingly. Sorry, said Carter, who was wearing a black jacket with a red shirt underneath and jeans. But I'd love some. Come, come, Betty urged, motioning for everyone to follow her as she turned to head toward the dining room. However, the Major called out to the older woman again. Betty turned around to look at her niece and then at the young woman. She could see a subtle connection between the two of them, though she could not quite put her finger on it. Aunt Betty, Carter said gently. She walked toward the older woman and placed her arms around Betty's shoulders. I recently found out something about Ellie. Ellie? Betty asked, looking at the Major in confusion. Wasn't her grave cleaned? I specifically. Aunt Betty, Carter interrupted softly, holding on tightly to the woman's shoulders. I just found out that either the doctor or the nurse, or even both of them, did something to Ellie. What? Betty asked with growing concern. Sammy, what are you talking about? We held her in our arms. She was gone. I I know, Carter said, nodding solemnly as she stood in front of her. She held Betty's free hand with both of her own while Faith stood quietly beside her. I found out a few days ago that the doctor, or the nurse, or maybe it was a larger conspiracy, whatever it was, they injected Ellie with something when we weren't looking. What? The older woman gasped in disbelief. Before leaving the mountain, Carter had told the Slayer that there was a cover story in place for her that she would have to remember, especially around family members who lacked the clearance to know about the SGC, such as Aunt Betty, Mark, and his family. We're still not sure of the specifics, Carter explained carefully. There's an ongoing manhunt for them. But Ellie wasn't dead. They took her and replaced her with the body of another baby who had passed away earlier that day in the hospital. The whole situation is being investigated by both the hospital and the Air Force. But what we do know is that Ellie is alive, and she was sent to Boston. Sammy! Betty gasped, dropping her cane in shock. She reached out with her free hand and gripped the blonde officer's arm desperately. We need to get her back. We found her, the Major said softly, turning her eyes toward Faith, who gave Betty a small, reassuring smile. Faith watched as the older woman's mouth fell open. Betty looked back and forth between the Major and Faith before settling her gaze entirely on the young Slayer. Faith felt her own chest tighten as she saw the older woman's shoulder tremble, sensing the immense pain Betty must have carried for so many years. Ellie? Betty whispered, gazing at Faith as Carter gently helped her step forward. Faith nervously took a few steps toward her as well. Once Betty was close enough, she raised her trembling hands and placed them gently on both of Faith's cheeks. She used one hand to caress her cheek while the other traced her forehead, nose, and ears before returning to rest on her cheeks. Ellie? Faith wanted to speak, but no words would form in her throat. All she could see were the tears welling up in the older woman's eyes. Meanwhile, Carter bent down to retrieve the cane from the floor before walking over to stand right beside Faith. Faith glanced toward Daniel, who offered her a small, encouraging smile, and then to Teal'c, who gave her a respectful nod. Looking back at Betty, Faith felt the reality of the moment finally wash over her. She actually had a family now. Yes, yes, Faith managed to say softly. Betty immediately pulled her into a tight, desperate embrace. Aunt Betty, meet Ellie Faith Carter, the Major announced gently, resting a supporting hand on Faith's shoulder as Betty began to sob, holding Faith even closer. After a few emotional moments, Betty pulled back to look at Faith before leaning forward again to kiss the young Slayer all over her face. She held tightly onto Faith's hand without saying another word, then accepted the cane that Carter handed back to her. Come with me, Ellie, Betty said excitedly, pulling the young woman toward the dining room. You're far too thin. I have some cookies in the oven and... I'm all right, Faith replied nervously, allowing herself to be guided while glancing back at Daniel, who beamed a wide smile at her. She then looked toward Carter, who followed close behind, while Teal'c quietly observed the house. Nonsense, Betty insisted joyfully, leading Faith to a chair and helping her sit down. I want to know everything about you, about your life, and how you found Sam. Betty then looked up at Carter and asked if her father knew about Faith yet. He's overseas, Carter explained as she stood beside Faith. I've already sent him a message, so he should receive it by tomorrow. Good, good, Betty murmured happily. Carter stepped into the kitchen to help her, returning a moment later with a plate of fresh cookies. She handed one to Faith, who smiled up at her mother in gratitude. Carter then offered the treat to Daniel and Teal'c as they joined them in the dining area. Teal'c took his spot, standing protectively behind Faith, while Daniel took a seat nearby. Faith looked into the kitchen as the Major and Betty pulled more food from the fridge. She smiled softly when her mother looked up and caught her eye, before turning her gaze to Daniel and Teal'c. Finally, she looked down at the table, a warm realization settling deep in her heart. This is a family. To be continued.